The bookstore encounter. The bell above the door chimed softly as Nora Chen looked up from the stack of overdue bills spread across her small desk. October rain drummed against the windows of Between the Lines, her independent bookstore nestled in Portland's struggling arts district. The afternoon light was dim, casting long shadows between the towering shelves that housed everything from worn poetry collections to pristine literary fiction that few people seemed interested in buying anymore. She didn't recognize the man, who entered, shaking raindrops from his expensive coat. He was tall, probably in his early 40s, with dark hair touched by silver at the temples and the kind of sharp, tailored appearance that screamed money. His eyes swept the store with an analytical precision that made Nora immediately wary. She'd seen that look before, developers and investors who viewed her beloved bookstore as nothing more than prime real estate waiting to be flipped. "Can I help you find something?" Nora asked, her voice carefully neutral as she stood and smoothed her vintage cardigan. The man's gaze settled on her, and she caught something unexpected: exhaustion, maybe even vulnerability, before his expression hardened into polished indifference. "Just browsing," he replied curtly, moving toward the philosophy section with purposeful strides. Nora returned to her paperwork, but found herself glancing at him periodically. There was something familiar about his profile, something that nagged at her memory. When he pulled out his phone to take a call, his voice carried across the quiet store. "James, I don't care what the board thinks. The Portland project is off the table for now." A pause. "Because I said so. Handle the press conference without me." That voice. Nora's stomach dropped as recognition hit her like a cold wave. Marcus Blackwood, the pharmaceutical CEO who'd been all over the news for the past month, facing criticism for his company's aggressive pricing strategies and recent factory closures that had devastated 3 small towns. The man whose decisions had put hundreds of people out of work, whose face had become synonymous with corporate greed in the local papers. She watched him end the call and rub his temples, suddenly looking older than his years. For a moment, he seemed almost human. Then he noticed her staring. "Problem." His tone was sharp enough to cut glass. "No problem," Nora replied evenly, but her warmth had evaporated. "I just recognized you from the news. Marcus Blackwood, right?" His jaw tightened. "And you are someone whose friends lost their jobs when you closed the Millfield plant." The words came out before she could stop them, carrying years of frustration, about watching her community struggle while men in suits made decisions from boardrooms hundreds of miles away. Marcus's expression went completely cold. "You don't know anything about that situation. I know that 300 families are struggling to pay rent because of choices you made." Nora crossed her arms, surprised by her own boldness. She usually avoided confrontation, preferring the safety of her books and the gentle customers who appreciated literature. "And I suppose you think running a failing bookstore makes you an expert on business decisions?" The cruelty in his voice was precise, designed to wound. The comment hit its mark. Nora felt heat rise in her cheeks as she glanced at the bills on her desk, at the empty spaces where bestsellers should be, at the coffee ring stains on furniture she couldn't afford to replace. He was right, and they both knew it. But instead of backing down, something unexpected happened. Nora laughed, not with humor, but with the kind of bitter recognition that comes from having nothing left to lose. "You're absolutely right," she said quietly. "I am failing. Every day I watch this place die a little more. And every day I pretend that love for books and good intentions are enough to keep the lights on. But at least I'm failing at something that matters to people, something that adds beauty to the world instead of taking it away." The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Marcus stared at her, his carefully constructed facade flickering for just a moment. In that brief crack, Nora glimpsed something she hadn't expected: pain that matched her own. Then the moment passed. Marcus straightened his coat and headed for the door without another word, leaving only the lingering scent of expensive cologne and the soft chime of the bell to mark his departure. Nora sank back into her chair, hands shaking slightly as she realized what she'd just done. She'd essentially insulted one of the most powerful men in the city. But as she looked around her beloved store, at the carefully curated shelves and the reading nook where teenagers came to escape their troubles, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Some things were worth defending, even when you were losing. Unlikely meetings. 3 days passed before Marcus Blackwood appeared in her doorway again. Nora was reorganizing the poetry section, trying to make the sparse shelves look fuller, when the familiar chime announced his arrival. This time, he didn't stride in with corporate confidence. He lingered near the entrance, hands buried deep in his coat pockets, looking almost uncertain. "We're open," Nora called out, not bothering to look up from her work. She could feel his presence like a storm cloud, heavy with unspoken tension. "I know." His voice was quieter than before, stripped of its earlier arrogance. "I wanted to apologize for what I said the other day. About your business failing. That was unnecessarily cruel." Nora finally turned to face him, surprised by the genuine contrition in his expression. "And I shouldn't have attacked you personally. I don't actually know you regardless of what I've read in the papers." Marcus nodded slowly, then gestured toward the poetry shelves. "Neruda? Third shelf, between Nakamura and Oliver." The response came automatically, born from years of helping customers navigate her carefully organized collection. He found the slim volume of 20 love poems and a song of despair with practiced ease, his fingers tracing the worn spine with surprising tenderness. "I haven't read this since college," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "You read poetry?" The question escaped before Nora could filter the surprise from her voice. A ghost of a smile crossed Marcus's face. "Hard to believe, considering my reputation as a soulless corporate monster." "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." He opened the book to a random page, his eyes scanning familiar lines. "My literature professor at Stanford used to say that poetry was the language of the heart trying to speak to the mind. I thought it was pretentious nonsense at the time. And now?" Marcus closed the book carefully, as if it might break under too much pressure. "Now I think maybe he was the only honest person in that entire university." Over the following weeks, Marcus began, appearing at irregular intervals. He never announced himself or made appointments, just materialized between the stacks like a well-dressed ghost. Sometimes he bought books, expensive first editions that Nora suspected he chose more for their price than their content. Other times he simply browsed, moving through the store with the careful reverence of someone visiting a sacred space. Nora found herself watching him during these visits, trying to reconcile the ruthless businessman from the headlines with the man who spent 20 minutes reading the same page of Rumi, his forehead creased in concentration. He was always impeccably dressed, $1,000 suits that probably cost more than her monthly rent. But there were small tells that spoke of inner turmoil. The way he rubbed his temples when he thought no one was looking. The slight tremor in his hands when he held his phone. The hollow look in his eyes when he thought she wasn't watching. "You don't strike me as the type who has time for browsing," Nora commented one Thursday afternoon, finding him in the philosophy section with a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius. "I make time for what matters," he replied without looking up. "And this matters?" Marcus finally met her gaze, and for a moment, his carefully maintained facade cracked completely. "This is the only place in the city where no one wants anything from me. Where I'm not Marcus Blackwood, CEO. I'm just another customer who might buy a book." The honesty in his admission caught Nora off guard. She'd expected deflection or corporate doublespeak, not this raw acknowledgement of isolation. "Is that what you want? To not be Marcus Blackwood?" He set the book down carefully, aligning it perfectly with the shelf's edge. I want to remember who I was before I became this version of myself. Before every decision was filtered through profit margins and shareholder expectations. Who were you? Marcus was quiet for so long that Nora thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of buried dreams. I was going to be a teacher. High school literature. Can you imagine? Marcus Blackwood, trying to convince 16-year-olds that Shakespeare wasn't torture disguised as homework. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. My father convinced me that teaching was for people who couldn't succeed in the real world. Said I was too smart to waste my life on such small ambitions. And now? Now I employ thousands of people and influence markets worth billions of dollars. I should feel successful. Marcus picked up the Marcus Aurelius again, thumbing through, pages filled with ancient wisdom about virtue and character. Instead, I feel like I'm drowning in someone else's life. Nora understood that feeling more intimately than she cared to admit. I always wanted to write, she found herself saying. Novels, poetry, anything. I told myself the bookstore was just a temporary thing, a way to pay the bills while I worked on my manuscript. What happened? Life, rent, reality. Nora gestured around the store that had become both her sanctuary and her prison. Turns out running a bookstore takes every ounce of energy I have. By the time I close each night, the last thing I want to do is write. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Two people who had somehow found themselves living lives that felt like elaborate performances of who they thought they should be. Would you? Marcus started, then stopped, looking uncertain again. Would you recommend something? Something I should read? Nora studied his face, trying to read the request beneath the question. What are you looking for? Something true. She led him to a small display near the front of the store, pulling out a slim volume with a simple cover. Joan Didion, The Year of Magical Thinking. It's about loss and grief and the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of chaos. Marcus took the book, studying the cover with the same intensity he'd shown the Neruda collection. Why this one? Because it's honest about how messy and complicated life really is, and because she writes about finding strength in admitting weakness. As Marcus handed her money for the book, exact change, she noticed, as if he'd looked up the price beforehand, their fingers brushed briefly. The contact was electric and unexpected, leaving both of them frozen for a heartbeat too long. Thank you, Marcus said quietly, stepping back as if the moment had burned him. For the book? For treating me like a person instead of a headline. After he left, Nora found herself staring at the door long after the bell had stopped chiming, wondering what she was getting herself into and why she didn't seem to care about the answer. The quiet confession. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, delivered by a process server who apologized profusely while handing Nora the legal documents that would end everything she'd built. She stared at the papers for a long time after he left, the words blurring together as the reality of her situation settled like lead in her stomach. 60 days. She had 60 days to come up with 3 months of back rent plus fees, or between the lines would become another empty storefront in a neighborhood already gutted by gentrification. Nora spent the rest of the day going through the motions, helping customers, processing returns, organizing inventory. But her heart wasn't in it. Everything felt surreal, like she was watching someone else's life collapse in slow motion. By evening, she'd sent the last customer away and flipped the sign to closed, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. Instead, she sat in the reading nook she'd created in the back corner, surrounded by the books that had been her constant companions, and finally let herself fall apart. She was still crying when Marcus appeared at the front door 20 minutes later. Through the glass, she could see him checking his watch, probably wondering why the lights were still on after closing time. She considered hiding, pretending she wasn't there, but exhaustion had stripped away her ability to maintain pretenses. When she unlocked the door, Marcus took one look at her tear-stained face and stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. What happened? His voice carried an edge of something that might have been concern, though Nora was too drained to analyze it. She handed him the eviction notice wordlessly, watching his expression darken as he read. When he finished, he set the papers down carefully and looked around the store with new eyes, seeing not just the books and comfortable chaos, but the dream that was about to die. "How much do you need?" The question was matter-of-fact, businessman. To failing business owner. "I don't want your money." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, fueled by pride and desperation in equal measure. "That's not what I asked." Nora sank into one of the mismatched armchairs she'd rescued from. Estate sales, feeling every ounce of fight drain out of her. "It doesn't matter how much. I can't keep doing this." "Doing what?" "Pretending." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Pretending that passion is enough. Pretending that if I just work harder, care more, somehow the numbers will magically work out. Pretending that I'm strong enough to save this place by myself. Marcus moved closer, his expensive shoes silent on the worn hardwood floors. "You are strong enough." "No, I'm not." Nora's voice cracked, and she pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to hold back fresh tears. "I've spent my whole life pretending. I'm strong enough to handle everything alone, but I'm drowning, and I'm tired of pretending I'm not." The confession shocked them both. Nora because she'd never admitted her weakness so starkly, even to herself, and Marcus because he recognized his own desperate isolation reflected in her words. Marcus lowered himself into the chair across from her, his usual perfect posture forgotten. For several minutes neither of them spoke. The store felt suspended in time, filled with the weight of unspoken truths and the faint scent of old paper and dreams deferred. "I understand drowning," Marcus finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been drowning for years, but I've gotten so good at the performance that even I forget sometimes." "What performance?" "Success. Control. The illusion that having power means having purpose." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly together. "Do you know what I did yesterday? I approved layoffs for 200 more employees. Good people with families and mortgages and dreams. I signed the papers while eating a $30 salad in my office, and I told myself it was necessary for the greater good of the company." Nora lifted her head to look at him, seeing something she'd never expected, genuine anguish. "But that night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those families, about the conversations happening around kitchen tables because of a decision I made in 15 seconds, and I realized that somewhere along the way, I'd become exactly the kind of person I used to despise." "So, why do it?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "Because I'm good at it, because it's expected, because stopping would mean admitting that the last 20 years of my life have been a mistake." He paused, studying her face in the dim light. "Because I'm drowning too, and I've forgotten how to swim toward shore instead of just treading water." The parallel wasn't lost on either of them. Two people seemingly from opposite worlds, both suffocating under the weight of expectations. Hers self-imposed, his inherited and internalized. "I used to love books because they showed me different ways to live," Nora said quietly. "Different possibilities. But somewhere along the way, I stopped believing those possibilities applied to me. And I used to believe that success meant making a difference. Now I'm not sure what I believe anymore." They sat in comfortable silence as rain continued to drum. Against the windows and the city's evening sounds filtered through the walls. Nora felt something shifting between them, a recognition that went deeper than attraction or sympathy. It was the profound relief of being truly seen by another person, flaws, fears, and failures included. "I should go," Marcus said eventually, but he made no move to stand. You should, Nora agreed, but she didn't want him to leave. When he finally did rise from his chair, he moved slowly, reluctantly. At the door, he turned back to face her. The money offer still stands, not as charity, but as an investment in something that matters. I can't think about it, he interrupted gently. Not for me, but for everyone who needs this place to exist. For the teenagers who come here to escape. For the elderly customers who treat your recommendations like gospel. For yourself. After he left, Nora remained in the reading nook until well past midnight, surrounded by books and the echoes of the most honest conversation she'd had in years. The eviction notice lay on the table beside her, but for the first time since receiving it, she felt something other than despair. She felt the dangerous stirring of hope. Walls coming down. The changes in Marcus Blackwood didn't happen overnight, but they were impossible to ignore once you knew what to look for. Nora noticed them first during his increasingly frequent visits to the bookstore, the way he'd started, reading entire books instead of just browsing, the questions he asked about her recommendations, the careful attention he paid when she talked about authors and their motivations. But the changes extended beyond their conversations. Marcus had begun making what he called different kinds of investments. A struggling community center in southeast Portland suddenly received an anonymous donation large enough to fund their after-school programs for 2 years. A small family, restaurant facing closure due to medical bills, found their debt mysteriously paid off by a private benefactor. 3 local artists received grants from a foundation that hadn't existed the month before. You're being reckless, James Rivera announced, barging into Marcus's corner office without knocking. His business partner for the past decade looked genuinely concerned, which was unusual for a man who typically reserved his emotions for quarterly reports and hostile takeovers. Marcus didn't look up from the proposal he was reviewing. A plan to convert one of their idle pharmaceutical plants into a job training center for displaced manufacturing workers. Define reckless. The Portland Community Investment Fund, the employee retention bonuses, the decision to keep the Millfield plant open despite the numbers. James ticked off items on his fingers like a prosecutor building a case. You've allocated nearly $50 million to projects that will never generate return on investment. Won't they? Marcus finally raised his eyes from the paperwork, and James was startled by what he saw there. Where there had once been cold calculation, there was now something warmer and more complex, something that looked dangerously like hope. These are business decisions, Marcus, not charity work. Our shareholders will continue to see healthy profits while we find ways to be profitable that don't require sacrificing our humanity. Marcus stood and moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. When did we decide that maximum profit was the only measure of success? James stared at his longtime partner as if he were speaking a foreign language. Since we started this company, since we agreed that sentiment was the enemy of good business. Maybe we were wrong. Jesus, Marcus, what's happened to you? James moved closer, genuine concern replacing his professional frustration. You've been different for weeks, distracted, making decisions based on... He paused, searching for the right word. Based on feelings instead of facts. Marcus turned from the window, a slight smile playing at the edges of his mouth. I met someone. A woman? James's relief was palpable. Well, why didn't you say so? I was beginning to think you were having some kind of breakdown. Who is she? Someone from the Portland social scene? Another CEO? She owns a bookstore. The smile faded from James's face. A bookstore. A small independent bookstore in the arts district. She's smart, passionate, completely broke, and... Marcus paused, trying to find words for something he'd never experienced before. She sees the world the way I used to, before I forgot that business could be about more than just making money. Marcus. James's voice carried the patient tone of someone explaining basic mathematics to a child. You cannot restructure a multi-billion-dollar company because you're infatuated with some struggling shop owner. I'm not restructuring anything. I'm remembering why I wanted to build something in the first place. Marcus returned to his desk, picking up a framed photo he'd never displayed before. A candid shot of Nora arranging books, completely absorbed in her work, sunlight streaming through the store's front window. She's not trying to change me, James. She's just authentic. And being around her reminds me what authentic feels like. James studied the photo with the expression of a man trying to identify a particularly dangerous species of bacteria. She's using you? For what? I haven't given her anything except the cost of a few books. Then what does she want? Marcus considered the question seriously. In his world, everyone wanted something: access, influence, money, power. The idea that someone might simply enjoy his company without ulterior motives was so foreign it had taken him weeks to accept its possibility. I think she wants me to be happy, he said finally. That's not a business model, Marcus. No, Marcus agreed. It's not. The conversation ended there, but James's warnings echoed in Marcus's mind over the following days. Not because he doubted Nora's sincerity, but because they forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. He was changing, and the changes were accelerating beyond his control. He found himself questioning decisions that had once seemed automatic. When presented with a proposal to acquire a smaller competitor, his first thought wasn't about market share or profit margins, but about the employees who would lose their jobs in the inevitable restructuring. When his legal team recommended aggressive tactics to minimize the company's tax obligations, he found himself asking what those taxes might fund: schools, roads, programs that helped communities like the one where Nora's bookstore struggled to survive. The shift was subtle but seismic, like continental plates moving deep beneath the Earth's surface. Marcus Blackwood, the ruthless pharmaceutical CEO, was disappearing. In his place was emerging someone he barely recognized, someone who cared more about building something meaningful than maximizing quarterly returns. The realization both thrilled and terrified him. One evening, as he sat in between the lines reading a collection of essays Nora had recommended, he looked up to find her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. "What?" he asked. "You look different." She said thoughtfully, "Lighter somehow. Is that good or bad?" Nora considered the question with the careful attention she gave to selecting books for particular customers. "It's honest," she said finally, "and I think honesty looks good on you." As Marcus walked back to his downtown apartment that night, James's warnings felt increasingly distant and irrelevant. He was changing, yes. The man who had walked into Between the Lines 6 weeks ago, armored in expensive suits and corporate cynicism, was evolving into someone he hadn't been since college. Someone who remembered that success could be measured in more than dollars. Someone who was learning to care more about who he was becoming than who he had been expected to be. Someone who was falling in love not just with Nora, but with the possibility of living an authentic life. Building something new. The proposal came to Nora not as a rescue, but as a partnership. Marcus arrived at the bookstore on a crisp December morning carrying 2 cups of coffee and a leather portfolio that looked expensive enough to fund her rent for several months. He'd learned her coffee preferences during their conversations: dark roast, no sugar, just a splash of cream, and the small consideration touched her more than grand gestures might have. "I have an idea," he said without preamble, settling into what had become his usual chair in the reading nook. "And before you say no, I want you to hear me out completely." Nora accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her fingers around the warm cup. "I'm listening." Marcus opened the portfolio and spread several documents across the small table between them. Architectural drawings, business projections, demographic studies, the kind of professional materials that represented hours of expert consultation and significant financial investment. "What if we didn't just save between the lines?" he began, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone who'd found a puzzle worth solving. "What if we expanded it into something bigger, something that could serve the community while also being financially sustainable?" The drawings showed a transformed version of the building that housed her store, plus the two vacant spaces on either side. Where there was now a struggling bookstore and empty storefronts, the plans revealed a comprehensive literary center with expanded retail space, a coffee bar, multiple reading areas, a small performance space for author readings and community events, and, most remarkably, a series of small offices designed for local writers and literary organizations. "A literary hub," Marcus explained, watching her face carefully for reactions. "Sustainable retail anchored by community programming. The bookstore would be the heart of it, but there would be multiple revenue streams: coffee sales, event rentals, co-working space fees, writing workshops." Nora studied the plans with growing amazement and creeping anxiety. "This would cost a lot," Marcus admitted, "but I've run the numbers with 3 different consulting firms. It's not charity, it's a viable business model that happens to serve a social good. And what would my role be in this partnership?" "You'd be the director of literary programming and community outreach, full creative control over book selection, author events, workshop curricula, plus equity in the business, not just employment." Marcus leaned forward, his intensity almost overwhelming. "This isn't about me saving your bookstore, Nora. This is about us building something neither of us could create alone." The word "us" hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond business arrangements. Over the past 2 months, their relationship had evolved from antagonistic to cordial to something neither of them was quite ready to name. They'd shared books, conversations, quiet moments of understanding, but they'd never explicitly acknowledged the growing intimacy between them. "Why?" Nora asked quietly. "Why this? Why now? Why me?" Marcus set down his coffee and leaned back in his chair, his expression more open than she'd ever seen it. "Because 6 months ago, I was a man who measured success entirely by the size of my bank account and the fear I could inspire in my competitors. I was successful by every metric that mattered to the world I lived in, and I was completely empty." He gestured around the bookstore, taking in the mismatched furniture, the handwritten shelf tags, the reading nook they'd been sitting in during a dozen conversations that had slowly changed both their lives. "This place, what you've built here, it's everything I thought I was too smart to want. It's small, it's unprofitable, it's inefficient by every business standard I know." His voice softened. "And it's the most meaningful space I've encountered in 20 years. "It's failing," Nora pointed out, though her protest lacked conviction. "It's struggling. There's a difference." Marcus gathered the architectural drawings, organizing them into a neat stack. "I've spent my career building things that generate wealth but don't actually matter to anyone. You've built something that matters enormously but can't generate enough wealth to survive. What if we combined those skill sets?" Nora stood and walked to the front of the store, looking out at the street where foot traffic was already picking up as the neighborhood slowly gentrified around her. She could see the possibilities Marcus was describing. The same space, but fuller, livelier, more integral to the community's daily life. "I've never had a business partner," she said finally. "I've never had a business partner I trusted completely," Marcus replied. "This is new territory for both of us." "And what about—" She gestured vaguely between them, unable to articulate the personal dimension of what he was proposing. Marcus joined her at the window, standing close enough that she could smell his cologne and the faint scent of the coffee they'd shared. "What about it?" "If we do this, the business, I mean, and if we—" She paused, frustrated by her inability to name what was happening between them. "What if it doesn't work out? The personal part, I mean." Then we'll figure it out like adults, Marcus said simply. But Nora, I need you to know something. He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. I'm not proposing this partnership because I'm attracted to you, though I am. I'm not doing it because I want to impress you, though I hope it does. I'm doing it because for the first time in years, I've found something worth building that's bigger than my own ambitions. The honesty in his voice was devastating in its simplicity. Nora felt tears pricking at her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being truly understood. I'm scared, she admitted. Good, Marcus said, smiling slightly. I'd be worried if you weren't. I'm terrified. Of what? Of caring this much about something. Of depending on another person. Of the possibility that I might actually be capable of building something beautiful instead of just profitable. He paused. Of the possibility that someone like you might actually want to build it with someone like me. 3 months later, the grand opening of the Portland Literary Center drew nearly 300 people to the transformed space where Between the Lines had once struggled alone. Local authors read from their work in the small performance area. Teenagers claimed the comfortable seating areas with the same possessive enthusiasm they'd once shown for Nora's original reading nook. The coffee bar buzzed with conversations about books, writing, and the kind of community connections that couldn't be measured in profit margins. Nora stood near the entrance, watching the crowd with a mixture of pride and disbelief. She wore a simple black dress, professional but still recognizably herself, and her hair was pulled back in a way that made her look both scholarly and approachable. Marcus appeared beside her, carrying 2 glasses of champagne and wearing the kind of genuine smile she'd rarely seen during their early encounters. Regrets? He asked, offering her one of the glasses. Nora accepted the champagne and considered the question seriously. The past 3 months had been a whirlwind of construction, planning, hiring, and the complex negotiations that came with blending 2 very different approaches to business. There had been disagreements, compromises, moments when she'd wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. But as she looked around the space, her space, their space, she felt only gratitude for the courage to say yes to a partnership that had already exceeded her wildest dreams. Only one, she said, raising her glass. What's that? I regret that it took us so long to figure out what we could build together. Marcus touched his glass to hers, the soft chime barely audible above the happy noise of their opening night celebration. Then let's make sure we don't waste any more time. As they moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and watching their vision come to life around them, both of them understood that they'd created something more valuable than a successful business. They'd built a partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and the radical idea that success could be measured by the positive impact they had on other people's lives. It wasn't the life either of them had planned, but it was authentic, meaningful, and entirely their own. And as Nora watched a group of teenagers discover new books in the expanded young adult section, she realized that sometimes the best things in life came not from holding on to what you thought you wanted, but from having the courage to build something better with the right person beside you.